Great. Thank you very much, Gwen. It is now my pleasure to welcome the Geopolitical Critical Metals Pipeline panel, moderated by Matthew Zolnowski of Greyfriars.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I do realize we are the second to last panel between you and happy hour, so we will endeavor to be both entertaining and brief as much as we possibly can. But again, first and foremost, again, thank you to Joanne and to my fellow panelists for coming and speaking with you this afternoon and sharing your perspectives on geopolitical risk. Just a brief note about structure again. We'll have just some introductory comments by myself, introductions from each of the panelists, and then some free open remarks on their part, some structured Q&A, and if we have time at the end, we'll open it up to the floor for questions. So first, as we were assembling this panel discussion, the thesis that we came to was that geopolitical risk was the single largest driver in the mining sector today. But that being said, as we start to unpack geopolitical risk, one of the things that I'd encourage you in the audience to think about is just how much of this geopolitical risk is wholly new, or is it simply that we are struggling to keep up with the pace of the new normal? Moreover, it's relatively common to think of geopolitical risk as a negative or as a dragging down factor in the critical mineral sector. But on the other hand, is geopolitics actually opening up new doors and new opportunities for mining projects? So just to give a few examples of things that are not new and new. It's not new that tariffs are a key part of US government policy on critical materials. This was certainly the case during the second Bush administration with steel tariffs, certainly during the first Trump administration with steel, aluminum, and other tariffs. However, what is a little bit new is the magnitude and the pacing at which those tariffs are starting to arrive. It is not new to see the Defense Production Act being used for critical minerals of all sorts of stripes. What is new is the clawback of US government spending, for example, on clean energy projects, or possibly even the clawback of Inflation Reduction Act incentives for mineral processing in the United States. It's not new for the United States to harangue its allies on military spending, whether in NATO, East Asia, or anywhere else around the globe. What is certainly new is to see our European allies, and particularly the European Commission, step up in a very significant way to provide new funding for military spending and general industrial investment across the Eurozone. It's also not new to see tension between the United States and China on supply chains or critical technologies. In particular, think about the exfiltration of critical technology through cyber attacks. However, it is new to see critical minerals being used as a potentially deliberate tool of strategic leverage and strategic competition. So with that foundation in place, I'm going to turn it over to my panelists now to go one at a time for some introductions and opening remarks. So Bela, we'll start with you.
Yep, thank you. Appreciate it. So my name is Bela Onken. I'm from KfW. I'm responsible for the mining sector in North America, which is Canada and the US. And I mean, I think what you just said, I mean, yes, I see it greatly as opportunities now from the geopolitical perspectives. Just as a quick introduction, who we are, KfW IPEX-Bank is a bank owned by the German government, but it's operating as a full commercial bank. We have our own banking license. So we are acting as a full commercial bank, but with a clear mandate as well to support our purpose. And one of the purposes we support is to promote transatlantic business or transatlantic trade, or promote relations between the European Union and its allies, which has never been more important than today. So it's a time which was very exciting to be here. I've been with the bank 20 years. I've seen mining projects for a while evolving, but I've never seen so many mining projects building up in North America as now. I mean, it used to be that, I mean, we have been a big financier of mining projects on a global basis. Most of our projects used to be in South America, in Asia, Africa, politically very challenging jurisdictions where you have complete different geopolitical risk, what we're talking about today. And yes, I mean, we're here to support North American mining projects, which also have a link to Europe. So in a partnership approach where the projects benefit the region, the host country, be it the US, be it Quebec, be it Canada, but also bring some benefit to the European Union, which is our shareholder. So we like to have our partnership approach here. And we believe that is well done in our alliance, in our global alliance and with our allies. And I see wonderful potential now working across the US, Canada, and Europe on bringing that supply chain together and getting more independence from China and other nations of concern, as we call them.
François?
Thank you for the invitation. François Vézina, CEO of Dumont Nickel, president of Minéraux critiques Stratégiques Abitibi. Mining engineer by training, been with several mining companies. Newcomer to the critical and strategic space, I've always been in gold, so substantial change. I've been with Dumont for the last year. The Dumont Nickel project is a project in the Abitibi region, has been known for several years, has the permit, has an IBA with the nations. There's a new twist with the Dumont project right now with the critical and strategic space developing with an intent to provide material to the EV market lately. An open pit mine with the production about 42,000 tons of nickel annually, life of mine of 29 years, reserves of 1 billion tons. It's a rare project, a low grade. And you know, the EV market and critical and strategic new development and has opened up doors to the original project that intended to send the nickel to the smelters in Sudbury. So it's an interesting time, definitely. And Minéraux critiques and Stratégiques Abitibi has been developed to support the Dumont Nickel project, but other projects also in the Abitibi space right now. Both projects are owned by Quintera Capital, a private fund that has envisioned and looks at the market before purchasing the project. A bit different than what we do usually in the mining space. You know, they look at the market, the potential, and I'll be discussing about that in this panel.
Keith?
Yeah, and can you hear me? Yeah. My name is Keith Spence. I'm the principal of Global Mining Capital. We're a private equity M&A shop. We specialize in late-stage near development projects globally, or sweet spot projects that are shovel-ready and about to go into production. We like projects outside of the Anglosphere, which I'm going to talk about. So that's projects in Latin America, Africa, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and a sprinkling of projects in certain European countries. In general, our appetite is for projects that are strategic. So we like all the critical minerals, we like gold, we like copper, and we like uranium. Our big three is gold, copper, and uranium. But we like all the other critical minerals. The only thing that we were not too particularly interested in is iron ore and coal. I touched on that bifurcation, and just to develop that theme later on. The world has now bifurcated into two camps, and I've talked a lot about this. I spoke about it recently in New York. We have what I call the Anglosphere, which is basically the old Western world, Canada, Australia, the EU, and the US, and some of their affiliates. And then we have the Sinosphere, which is dominated by China and Russia. And then sprinklings of a third camp, emergent camp, I call it, the emergent opportunists, which used to be called the non-aligned countries. And that includes some of the BRICS countries like Brazil, India. I'd put South Africa in that group, straddling both camps. And I'll also put Saudi Arabia as a new player in that group. And what we're seeing is the two big camps, the Sinosphere and the Anglosphere, competing for influence and dominance among the former non-aligned countries, which is I say, the emerging opportunists. And what that means for the mining space, and that's the key point, you know, people, I used to be a project financier. I worked for three of the major banks, Bank of Montreal, RBC, and Scotia for a very short time. And I did a lot of projects around the world. But one of the things that we're seeing, the typical risk used to be, is the infrastructure there? What about the local political risk? Which is, I want to differentiate country risk from geopolitical risk. Geopolitical risk is the interaction of countries and blocks of countries, as opposed to specific in-country risk, like risk of expropriation, or creeping expropriation, or changing the tax regime, and some of the things that are done locally. What we're seeing now is that this big geopolitical risk is really the biggest, the elephant in the room, and I'll talk about it more later. You know, it's affecting funding. I would say it's affecting valuations. It's affecting M&A probabilities. It's affecting a lot of possibilities within our space, because before you had one large pie, and now the pie is divided into half. And I would argue one of the reasons why the juniors are suffering so much, and have been suffering so much until maybe I think the last month or so, where they're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel, is because the pot of money that is available is only half of the pot of money. Some of the other things that I want to talk about is the China factor, but we'll talk a little about that. I ran a company, Alliance Pacific Resources, in Western China. I spent more than a decade plus in Xinjiang, which is the westernmost province of China, in the Gobi. We were looking for gold and base metals. And that's when China changed from what we call investee country, i.e. people going to China. At least there were about 80 Canadian and Australian companies listed in China at one time. And now there's one, maybe two, you could argue two. And that whole dynamics have changed. And there's a lot of China dynamics in the bifurcation of the world. I'll talk a little more about. So for now, I'll just keep it there.
No, I appreciate those comments. And we're certainly going to come back on that bifurcation topic as well. So first, actually start, Bela, with you for a question. And that is, certainly as a engineering-focused sector, it is very easy to turn negative when assessing a project or assessing risk in a project. But one of the comments you brought up in the introduction is that at the same time, geopolitical risk actually presents opportunities for companies as well. One factor that comes to mind is that also certainly, yes, rising energy prices in the Eurozone following Russia's invasion of Ukraine was decidedly not positive. But on the flip side, that probably formed some sort of a catalyst for the European Parliament to adopt the Critical Raw Materials Act. And so I want to pull on that thread a little bit about where do you see the opportunity space from geopolitical risk?
Yes, and that's an excellent point, and I like the way you phrased it, or you framed it, because I actually see and we discussed it before, I see geopolitical risk less as an obstacle today for the pipeline. It's more like a driving factor. It's actually an accelerator, and it's a big opportunity, probably one of the most historic opportunities for the Western world, European Union, US, and Canada to come together and build a strong alliance in the supply chain, develop jointly together critical minerals, which is needed to keep the Western world, the industrial world it is, and keep the competitive edge against China and other emerging countries. And I would say what you mentioned earlier, yes, it has been a wake-up call for the European Union, or especially Germany, my home country, with the Ukraine crisis, because Germany, as you all know, has been extremely reliant on the energy supply from Russia, getting the gas from Russia. And so when each of a sudden that supply chain stopped or was no longer as secure as it was, and electricity prices basically tripled or quadrupled in Germany, it was a wake-up call. I mean, fortunately now the situation has improved. I mean, the European Union learned, I mean, they diversified their sources of energy. They got sources from energy now from many different countries, including the US, which actually is a positive example how actually that helped to bring the US closer to Germany and the European Union. But that was a wake-up call. You don't want to depend on one country or one supplier. It's just not a good idea and especially if that country you're depending on is not a friendly country like Canada or the US, but a country that can turn around any moment and show the ugly face to you. So that was a wake-up call, and I think that certainly stimulated the European Union to think about critical mineral strategy and supply chain. And now, I mean, Western nations have realized that there's an extreme dependency on China. I mean, 1 year ago, I was hearing a US senator saying that the US has never been in such a situation before in the history, being dependent on one country, which is not even a country that is friendly to the US, on such a critical supply chain. So that's why Donald Trump, in his executive order, also said he wants to strengthen the US supply chain and critical minerals, and ordered the US IPEX-Bank to support that projects. So I see that Canada has done the same, supporting massively projects. So the government of Canada, all entities of the Canadian government from the provinces. Quebec is doing a wonderful job working on several projects we're working on. And besides all the noise we see on the tariff front, what you mentioned, I see a wonderful opportunity for the US, Canada, and Europe to work closer together, getting a strong supply chain and bundle their forces. Of course, each country wants to secure critical minerals for their own country, but also we can do it together. And then I think that's the opportunity. And I think, yes, there's a strong understanding that Canada, European Union, and the US are strong allies, and doing something together is better than doing it against each other. And especially if we have, as you mentioned, such a big elephant in the room like China, who is basically, I mean, if you look at the processing facilities, and I mean, your project is a wonderful example for that.
Yeah, not processing. I have some numbers.
Yes, I mean, 90% of current processing facilities, for example, in cobalt, is in China, which puts the Western world in a huge dependency. And I mean, we have seen it. We have seen in the last weeks where China used the poker card against the US, basically by putting restrictions on minerals, which are critical to the US. So I think that has been a wake-up call for everybody in Canada and the US. And so I see it as a wonderful opportunity. And to first, I love it because I love the European Union, Canada, and Europe, and the US working closer together. It's all nations I love. And so I think it's a wonderful opportunity for bringing them together closer, but also from a business perspective, I'm very excited because I've never seen such a strong pipeline of very promising, interesting projects in the US and Canada. Actually, François sitting next to me, representing one of the projects, Limon Nickel, one project we're looking at as well, which is a wonderful example. And so I think that is exciting times, and I see it's overall is positive. Yeah?
So actually on that point, that's actually a perfect segue over to you, François, to talk about your nickel cobalt project. I mean,
Yes.
Just one very quick framing, and that is certainly the past couple of years we've gone from frankly white hot demand in the automotive sector in North America to something that is either more muted, depending on your perspective, or something that's frankly just more sustainable as a long-term demand driver. And so in addition to addressing how you've perceived or experienced geopolitical risk for the Dumont project, could you also talk to, for example, has your strategy really changed at all? Or is it simply maintain the current strategy, but you now have new and much more interested partners? And I believe you also have some additional news about some strategic flag on your project.
You do.
Putting me on the spot. So I'm privileged to be here with two gentlemen that knows more. I've been educated really the last year because my background is all gold. And I'm more mine builders. I've built mine in Abitibi, Finland, and Mexico for different companies. This is very interesting time. That's brought me to Dumont project. You're asking and how Kinterra Capital approached me with this was, everybody knows to build a mine, you need a lot of capital. They told me about that, but I was wondering because very, very different approach than from gold. You go on the market and you look at that, and I said, I've been in Cisco Gold Royalties, and we've looked at the critical and strategic space, and the market is essential, and it has evolved drastically. So all this introduction to come to the point, I think one of the, as mine builders, as building the asset, one of the mistakes we're doing, most of us, is looking at the macroeconomics. I think you're going to talk more specifically, and I agree with Bela that you need to go more specific. And all minerals are different in the critical and strategic. Very, very different, very different space. I'll talk because I've been educated and I've read a lot, and they've been patient with me, but you look at nickel and cobalt. Okay, everybody knows nickel is mainly produced from Indonesia. We still have that tendency, and news goes out there. I've looked at numbers also from last year. Still 70% is going to stainless steel. And right now, everybody's bragging about, essentially, the market is increasing in its EV market, but it's still just 15% of the whole production of nickel worldwide. So it's not true that nickel produced in Indonesia essentially goes for the EV market. The other byproduct we have, and you could see the difference, is cobalt. So now cobalt, very different space also, coming from Congo, but 50% of all cobalt right now goes to the battery industry, the rechargeable battery. So 15%, 50% and 15%, very different market, I would say, and I'm not going to say I'm an expert on lithium, but people need to go and look at the market. Instead of, if we build it, they will come, the market will come. I think the critical and strategic is completely the opposite. You need to look at the market. There's regionalism also that you need to be attentive. You need to look at infrastructure. So for the Dumont project, the Kinterra Capital partners have always intended to go to the EV market and the car manufacturers. And they wanted to use the momentum that is here in Canada for Bécancour, that's developing the battery industry in Ontario. Quebec also was supportive, very supportive of those developments. You had the panel previously about the investment that Investissement Québec, and they're supportive on that. And it is true, it's working. Ontario as well. It's funny, we've never changed the strategy, and car manufacturers are our main focus and our main client. We negotiate offtake. Very different from going publicly on the market to sell something. And I think that's one thing that everybody has to learn in the mining space. We're basically doing a concentrate. The mine doesn't add a lot of value. And I would say cost-wise or price-wise of this is there's offer, demand, and this is what we see out there, but there's need. And for the car manufacturer, just coming and having a deal, an off-take deal with them to secure the supply is what they want. I've been very surprised when we've done due diligence with the car manufacturers. The question were not technical is secure this for 10 years. And it's a complete different angle from my past in gold. And I think you're going to see more and more of that, but you need to add value. The Dumont project has been around for 15 years. Actually, Keith, you were involved at a certain point.
With the Chinese.
Yes, he was talking to me about it. But I would say the Dumont version 2.0 is adding a processing facility, adding to it to produce an MHP. And not going to nickel sulfate, because that was interesting. That's essentially what the car manufacturers use, but every car manufacturers have a different type recipe for the nickel sulfate, but MHP is universal. And the Dumont project, they came to see that it had very interesting mineralogy. Basically, it's doesn't have any contaminants. So that's created the value of the project. But they went backwards, not looking at the deposit and trying to find a market, looking at the market and finding a deposit that could satisfy the market. So coming to your point, we've never changed strategy, and I think it's catching up to us positively right now at this point.
Yeah.
It's great.
Just one point I wanted to develop is with respect to geopolitics and China. There's lots of, I talked about risks and downside, but there's a lot of opportunities also. But one of the risks that I wanted to talk a little about before I talk about some of the opportunities is the fact that almost everything is processed in China. That's the bottleneck.
Exactly.
We forget that, we say, oh, I have a copper mine, or I have but almost everything is processed in China. We in the West, the Anglosphere, gave up that business because of environmental concerns. Nobody want a smelter or processor in California or in Canada, or we haven't been building, or even in Australia. So not only for environmental concerns, but one of the key things nobody talks about, we lost the skill set in how to process some of these critical minerals. It's unlike just normal processing of your classic base metals, etc., except in your unique case in Dumont, where you use high pressure and different kinds of. But in normal processing, it's almost like I say, like a great chef, where you add a little of this, a pinch of salt, a pinch of that over time. Maybe a little more pepper. And so the alchemists of refining and processing, the Chinese have have really exceeded and excelled in that area. And so notwithstanding the environmental issues, I think if we try to do it in North America, and we're trying to do it, all the Anglosphere, countries are trying to develop processing capability, and they might get over the environmental issue where people say, well, we're going to give you the permit. But I think they still have that alchemy of cooking the dish and having the chef. One of the things I wanted to talk about, just touch on, I have some statistics I did in New York last week. I think that these are quite profound statistics. A lot of, in terms of processing, let me see if I get it here. I had it here. Just when you need it, right? I had it before, and now suddenly I can't find it. Yeah.
Okay.
Here it is. Okay. China produces 65% of the world's rare earths, but China processes 90 to 95% of the world's rare earths. China processes and refines between 60 and 70% of the world's lithium. So we're talking about lithium here in Quebec, and we're talking about the lithium valley in Brazil. You know where it goes? It goes to, I'm doing some projects in Brazil, and everything is shipped to China. China processes 60% of the world's aluminum. That was a surprise for me, because aluminum, which is bauxite, is a power business, just like iron ore is a logistics business. And we have great power here in Canada, and we had Alcoa and Onken. And most of the downstream processing is China. China processes 40% of the world's copper. That's a big, there's smelters all over the place. I didn't know almost 50% of the world's copper is China. China produces 65% of the world's graphite, but, and here's the key point, China refines over 95% of the world's graphite for EV batteries. So no matter what you do, we mine it here, we explore for it here, it goes to China. China processes and refines 73% of the world's cobalt. And I know you have some cobalt in Dumont. While the DRC produces about 73% of the world's cobalt, China controls 15 of the 19 cobalt mining projects in the DRC. China processes and refines 70% of the world's nickel. While Indonesia produces about 50% of the world's nickel, about 80% of Indonesia battery nickel production is controlled by China-related companies. And almost 50% of additional new production in copper and cobalt and lithium is in some form either comes from China or related to China. So the China factor is something that we'll have to deal with. And I see a lot of opportunities here, of course, opportunities here for building our own processing facilities, but it's going to take a while to do so. Some of the other big plays that I'm seeing because of this geopolitics is security for minerals. So everybody knows about the deal with Ukraine that Trump is doing with Ukraine in terms of a security package for rare earths and other minerals. But the DRC went to Trump and the US to do a similar package. And I just heard through the grapevine other countries in Africa are trying to get security for minerals package. And I laugh about this because the US has Canada next door, which has most of these minerals, and we already have a security umbrella of NORAD, the North America Defense Pact. It will be easy to just to go north and firm up your security package with your next door neighbor. That is another issue to look at.
I can't see François objecting to that at all.
Yeah, well, that is something. And one little point I wanted to say before I forgot. I wrote the piece last week in the Assay magazine, and I talked a little about how the tariffs on Canada is actually turning out to be a blessing in disguise. Because number one, it's forcing young people and others, and your taxi driver, to appreciate what mining is, and realize that resources are good. So the image is going to change. So we're going to gain a lot on the image side. And then the other key point, and which is as important as the image, is that permitting will now happen. And people aren't going to say, not in my backyard. It's not going to be 15 years to develop a mine. We might be 5 years or less, because this is high speed. And the new government in Canada is talking about one-shop stop-in for one-shop permits. So that's some of the opportunities from the geopolitics. And so geopolitics has its negatives, and the negatives have been in play for the past few years, but I think some of the opportunities have come into play.
So for the next question, it's going to be 2 minutes apiece.
Yeah.
And then we're going to close out unless
Yeah.
folks have some burning questions. But in this case, it's going to be my turn to play the contrarian voice. So certainly when it comes to critical minerals, we've seen them go through these phases. So rare earths are the most important of the critical minerals. Battery minerals are the most important of the battery minerals. Uranium is the most important of the minerals. And then they go through these 2 to 4 year cycles where they're hot and then they're not, and then they're hot again and then they're not again. And so with that in mind, does geopolitics actually have staying power? And I'll give you a for instance. So currently there's a tremendous amount of stress around rare earth element supply chains, in particular to the automotive sector. But the vast majority of automotive companies don't produce defense products. And so is this actually a supply chain problem that requires immediate investment to fix? Or is this simply a short-term schedule disruption until the Chinese can figure out their regulatory regime? Do we really need to set our hair on fire over this, or is it just a 6-month blip until it evens out? So I'll start with Keith, and then we'll work back this way. So why does geopolitics have staying power?
Yes, I think it's more structural. I think it's going to be a little longer term because if you look at the Anglosphere and their relationship with China and the way they look at China, I don't see the China of the early 2000s where everybody was going to China. China was the great developing country where if we open a Coca-Cola plant and one Chinese buy one Coke, is going to be a billion Chinese and the multiply effect. I think those days are gone, at least for the short while. There's a book that I would highly recommend. It's called The Great Game. And I highly recommend it. It's about some of the geopolitics that happened in a place called Kashgar. The Chinese call it Kashgar. And in that book, they talk about how that's what, at that time, it was Britain and some of the big European powers, how the powers sort of, the machinations that went on behind the scenes. I think this is here to stay for a while. In my opinion, we'll have to adjust. I don't see it changing significantly. What I think might happen, and I was talking to a couple of people about that yesterday, is somebody playing the China card, and I think I touched on that with you, Matthew, where Canada, for example, could say, well, you know, let me play the China card and remove all its barriers. But China and Canada have terrible relations. We had a 3M problem recently, the last few years, so that might be difficult. But if China doesn't play the China card, what about the EU? They are now, you know, looking seriously at China, and I could see them playing the China card. So if the China card is played effectively by Canada and the EU, maybe, as you suggest, that bifurcation of the world and the geopolitics may subside, but it will still be prevalent.
François?
I think there's fundamental change structurally. I think Keith said it with China, but I think it's creating opportunity. Our project and our market that we're targeting is EU and North America. And you know, we're one of the first out of the gate. We're shovel ready, so we have kind of an edge on the other project. But when we talk about fundamental change, for sure, I have no doubt there's an energy transition. We all know that everybody's asking more and more energy. And I'm going to give us one thing interesting that the partners at Quintera told me is, like in the United States, AI and data center, that's consuming 10% of all the energy in the United States that we're not accounting for. And I would be surprised that somebody would argue with me that this won't expand substantially. We've talked behind the scene. Here it's more EV market. You go to United States and now Europe, defense minerals. I think this is coming. But from one mineral to another, there's substantial change. From one region to another, there's substantial change. I would say rare earth, you know, we think huge mines, rare earth, doesn't take large quantity. If you look at the battery space, graphite is going to be critical. That's the most important minerals in a battery that's going to be rechargeable. Nickel, cobalt, and are more important in quantity to produce. So you need to take that into account. But I think there's fundamental changes structurally, and I'm not saying that we're going to be retracting from that. I think from one time to another, it may change. I think the key is refining here in North America and Europe, and this is the game changer to extract in those regions as we go forward.
Thank you. Bela, up to you to close this out.
Yes, I do agree what you say. I mean, I would say it is a fundamental change which has been triggered. And so I think we're moving there. Having said that, I also kind of agree what you say, that I believe and I hope personally that geopolitical risk, what we experience now, will become less prominent topic in the future, and China will work better on, will align well with the US and Europe again, and as they do now. I mean, there are good relationships between US, China. China is important to the US, we should not forget that. China is important to Europe. Europe is important to China, US is important. There's a bilateral, or there is a strong dependency in both directions. We should not forget that, and I think everybody was realizing that. And besides all the geopolitical noise we hear, so put it on positive things, and I think, so I mean, as for example, we financing battery projects in the US as well, which is a good example where the US is onshoring their capabilities to become less dependent on China. But China is supporting the US, building that factory. Some of the factories are built by Chinese or supported by Chinese technology, which is helping actually the US getting the capabilities to onshore it. So there is behind the scene a lot of positive things happening. So that's why I think the geopolitical risk, which is quite prominent now in the media, and we talk about it, will fade over time, which is good. But I think the trigger factor is also positive. It will bring more processing facilities, capacities to Europe, US, Canada. We have seen we need it. We've seen also we need projects like you, Dumont. We don't want to get all our nickel from basically one jurisdiction, which is also from an ESG perspective maybe not the best. I think the Western world, especially premium automakers, what you're targeting as well, are also realizing maybe it's not a bad idea to have nickel from a country that has very high ESG standards. So overall, again, I see this as an opportunity. I think geopolitical is a triggering factor, and it will fade over time, but I think we will not go back. I think we won't go back that we say, oh, forget it, we just buy everything from China, let's get everything gone from China. I think that will not come back. I think it's a good working together and the process of moving together closer.
No, with that, again, thank you, Keith, François, and Bela for the panel. Thank you all for your attention, and I think that'll wrap it up for us. But take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.